Okay,
Okay,
all set.
we'll call the meeting to order. I see that there's one person that's called in on the phone. We can take citizens' comment for items not on the agenda. Does that person have any comments? I think Jason, you gave instructions on how they can raise their hand or.
Yep, well, I just unmuted them if you have any comment.
No comment, thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead then. Approval of the meeting minutes, May 4th. Council members, do you have any comments regarding that? No? Okay.
No, that's fine.
Hearing none, we'll go ahead and approve the meeting minutes. AB 20-059, ordinance adopting 2020 code amendments.
Okay, oops. So let me get down to my correct thing here.
So I will state before you start that on your council staff report, you have this huge analysis there, and what it did was actually state everything twice in there. So you need to cut out a whole paragraph of stuff that's already repeated.
Our apologies. It's the usual. A little peek behind the curtain. I write them in Word and then we paste them in, and the agenda builder strips all the formatting out. So sometimes it's easy to paste things in an extra time on accident. Councilmember Shepherd has her hand raised. Would you like to hear from her momentarily? Or should she wait? You're the chair.
We already took citizens' comment. I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me see here. Okay. So let me do that button. And I gotta move this out of my way. So I have to have the panelists list up at the same time to keep this going. So 2020 code amendments. These are a variety of amendments where staff's identified various inconsistencies in the code, typographical errors, and also just some things that don't work very well. So, okay, that didn't work. There we go. So I'll launch right into them, and there's 10 of them, as you saw in the staff reports. There's impervious surface limits in the residential zones. Currently, they're limited by a table in the zoning code, and this keep in mind does not apply on Snoqualmie Ridge. This applies to the rest of the city. The Snoqualmie Ridge has separate, if you want to call regulations for things like this. Anyway, the current allowed range is from 30 to 60% depending on the density. However, there's an exception for pervious pavement, and the way that exception is written is if the pervious pavement can infiltrate at a rate equivalent to what the ground naturally infiltrates at, then it doesn't count as an impervious surface, as pavement. So we had a project last year that proposed to use pervious pavement, which allowed them to sidestep the impervious surface limits. Now they didn't put a crazy amount of pavement on the ground, but it led us to the conclusion that in theory somebody could pave their entire site 100% using pervious concrete, which is not at all what the intent is. So the proposed change here would add a 15 percentage point cap on that. So if the allowed impervious surface is 35%, say, you could have pervious pavement that gets you up to 50%, as an example. The number, is, and I'll admit that number was chosen kind of as a rough, well, this sounds okay. I will admit I'm not wedded to it, but it seemed like we certainly want to promote the use of pervious concrete, pervious pavements for stormwater reasons, but we don't necessarily need to let people pave their whole property. The next one is the solid waste management plan. You'll hopefully all recall from last fall when the council was discussing the updated management plan that there is a code section in our municipal code that has some old and outdated references. So this would just be a cleanup of that.
So I guess maybe we should take comments as we go. So at the end, we would agree to move this forward. Do we have any comments regarding impervious surface? Ms. Councilmember Mayhew?
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
From Hawaii.
Councilmember, point of order, Councilmember Mayhew did not raise his hand.
I saw it. Oh, down in the chat thing?
Correct.
He did it physically.
I know.
He's busting my chops.
Okay, Councilmember Mayhew?
Yes. So I understand the concern. I don't understand the solution in the sense of so as I was listening to Mr. Rogers' statement, I understood what he said, but I didn't understand. So the point that kind of struck me is it was not the intent of this code section to allow the example he gave of 100% pervious paving of a lot. So I'm with him. I get that. What I don't, what I'm missing is what do we think the objective of the code section is? Why is adding 15% an answer as opposed to simply counting pervious the same as impervious? You know, I'm not arguing one or the other. I just don't understand what is it that we think the purpose of the code section is, and why is 15% the amount that would then match to that, you know, purpose? It seems like there's a policy decision underlying this, and I'm not clear what our policy purpose or sense of the policy that we're trying to accomplish here is.
Well, you've just identified the policy choice. I'll read for you the opening line of the code section and at issue here. It starts, to minimize building footprints and to maintain natural stormwater drainage and infiltration, impervious surface area limits shall be as set forth in table 2. So that's what the code states the purpose is. It's, you know, limit the building footprints, not have too much pavement on the site. But where those limits lie is absolutely a policy choice for the council to make. Currently, they're established, like I said, the range is from 30 to 60%, and lower density residential development gets the lower limit and higher density gets the higher limit. It's perfectly reasonable to say we don't want any, you know, we don't want to exceed the limits as they currently exist at all, pervious pavement or no. And that's certainly something that's a change we can make. Like I said, pervious pavement is generally a good idea to help, you know, to help with stormwater requirements, and, you know, because the stormwater requirements these days like to infiltrate water into the ground instead of collecting it in a big tank, for example. So it's helpful, and we like to promote it, but it doesn't mean we need to promote it to the extent of saying you can have extra pavement on your site just because you're using it. But what you're seeing is an attempt to maintain that general promotion of things like pervious pavement while putting a cap on it so that we don't get ridiculous outcomes here.
So could you just read those two, I found that really helpful, those two purpose point or clauses that you read a moment ago?
Sure. It says to minimize building footprints and to maintain natural stormwater drainage and infiltration, impervious surface area limits shall be as set forth in table 2.
All right, so let me see if I understand that. So the first point was to limit building footprints, yeah?
Right.
So if we add the 15% or we don't add the 15%, would that, how might that reasonably expected to, or would it be reasonably expected to impact building footprints?
So today, if the building of course counts as impervious surface, and a paved driveway or even a gravel driveway counts as impervious surface. So if you have a 30% limit, you can cover 30% of the site. If you allow pervious pavement to equal, say, 15% as proposed, then suddenly you can convert your driveway into pervious pavement and make your house bigger.
Got it. Okay, so then, Chair, my thought would be, I'm going to have a personal opinion of how I would vote on this at council, but it would seem helpful to, when this goes forward to council, to include, just highlight that there's a policy choice being made here, and you know, so that council could then, you know, decide, or it would be highlighted for them to decide where they're at on that policy, whether to add the 15% or not add it, or add some other percentage. Does that make sense?
Yep. I got it.
Okay, it does. 'Cause it's also, if you look at the ordinance, it's in there, pretty clear in there.
If I look at the ordinance?
Right, there's an ordinance and it has all the information in that.
Yeah.
Where does it lay out the different options of the policy here? 15% or not 15%? Where's that in the ordinance?
Well, on page 7, it talks about the impervious surface coverage and to minimize building footprints, what he just talked about.
I think Councilmember Ross is referring to the text I read is in the ordinance because that text exists today. But
Right.
the policy choice that we were just discussing is not necessarily highlighted in the ordinance, but it's definitely something I'll highlight in my presentation to the City Council next week.
That's what I was asking, Chair, is just that be highlighted to the council, that's a policy choice that the council, you know, could make here. To me, that didn't jump out of the ordinance or anywhere that was actually a policy choice being made, or that, you know, that there were other choices we could make, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, Jim, I hear what you're saying, and the edit is making a policy decision in saying that you could be 15 percentage points above the limits if you chose to add permeable pavement. That's something I would say for council could decide that 15%, is that the right amount? Is that not the right amount? Because it's really a policy-based decision. We could say policy could be 10%, policy could be 25%, policy could be something else. It's just a matter of.
Zero.
Well, let's not overwork it on. I think at this point, let's not overwork it. Which is, I think all he's asking for, Jason, is just mention that the council has the ability to determine what that percentage would be.
Mayor Larson?
I do want to note for the participants that, speaking from my experience, it's much easier just to focus on one little tab showing all the hands raised on that, using the participants or the, you know, the lower raised hand rather than trying to scan all the different folks in the meeting. Of course, this meeting's a little smaller, so it's easier. So just wanted to make that note real quick. Jason, Jim, I thought your questions were great. What I was still a little fuzzy on was, you know, before policy even becomes community value, what's the problem? And so I'm still not 100%. I mean, this would have been helpful to me if Jason led in saying, we're finding that houses are being built too big. We need more affordable, smaller homes, or, you know, or there's not enough landscaping. In other words, what's the problem that's trying to be solved by lessening the amount of pervious surface? Or there's too much runoff overwhelming the stormwater system or something, you know, just even if it's a few quick bullets that says, here's issues that we want to move the ball on to correct, and here's some policies or proposed solutions to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, Jason, you touched on that. I don't want to, again, try not to dwell, sorry, but I think you touched on that by saying that in the code, it does not limit you to how much permeable paving you could add on top of the table. Therefore, there needs to be a limit, because otherwise you could, in essence, cover your entire property with permeable paving, which, from my experience, is really a fancy way of saying it's kind of impervious. It's not. It really isn't. You know, it isn't soil. It's a hard surface.
Right, but I guess I was listening for it to take it one step further and say, why is covering my entire lot in concrete or housing structures a bad thing? You know, in other words, what are the values that are being compromised if everybody did that? I also kind of wanted to sort of make a joke about the fact that I know there's different regulations for Snoqualmie Ridge, but if this was applied to Snoqualmie Ridge, the entire place is pretty much an impervious surface.
Yeah, that's, the mayor's right on that one.
Okay,
But
Yeah,
yeah, anyway.
sounds like we have good input on that.
I think Phil might argue that it's about 49% impervious, but
I know what I meant is the ground here, even if it was all ground on my lot, you didn't put a single piece of concrete or house, you throw a bunch of water, it doesn't go through this glacial till. It's hard as
yeah, it's true. Okay, you're right. Let's move on.
Okay. So the solid waste management plan, you said you just made some updates to that.
Right, and you can, and the change is simply to delete the existing text in the relevant code section and add revised text that references the current interlocal agreement, the solid waste interlocal agreement, and the procedure that's in that one. So it means we won't have to update this. You know, when the council has to approve or not approve the solid waste management plan, when it gets updated by King County, we wouldn't have to keep updating the code section unless and until a new interlocal agreement is signed.
Right, 'cause last year we decided not to approve the comprehensive plan.
Correct.
Right. So just took that language out of there.
Right. Yeah, because
Mayor Larson, you have your hand up? Any other comments on solid waste? Nope. Okay.
okay. Next one, native growth protection easements. Currently, the city's critical areas code requires that we put critical areas and associated buffers into separate tracts to be dedicated to the city. This amendment would allow the city to have those be placed in what are called native growth protection easements at the city's discretion. This is mostly to provide additional options for the city for critical area protection. There are cases where the city would not necessarily want to take ownership of a critical area and or its buffer. Now, usually in the case of larger projects, say a subdivision, the city is going to take the critical area as a separate tract. It's usually better for all involved if the city can manage it comprehensively with the rest of our open space program. But for some smaller projects, it doesn't make a lot of sense in some cases because, for example, the city would not have any access to it. It's completely surrounded by private property, as an example. The easement language is very strong. It says you can't do anything with it, you can't develop it, you can't build anything in it. You have to just put up a fence and pretty much leave it alone. So the level of protection is pretty similar. It's just another tool in the toolbox, so to speak.
So who would maintain it at all?
Oops. Technically the private property owner would maintain it. But in practice, what that means is don't go in there.
Right. Okay.
I guess, Jason, clarify one thing for me there, if I can.
Yeah.
I should have raised my hand, sorry. If it's dedicated to the city, how does a private property owner maintain it? Does that basically indirectly then mean the city maintains it?
Well, so in the case of placing the critical area or buffer in a separate tract and dedicating it to the city, then it's the city's property and the city maintains it or doesn't maintain it, as the case may be. It would be managed as part of our open space. If it's not dedicated to the city, the easement language would prohibit all use, but it's still part of the property owner's property. But we wouldn't necessarily want them going on there and clearing, trees out of it, for example.
So how? I'm just thinking if this would have been the method at which some of the areas that we have currently, which are were established in easements and owners had some have expanded their personal space into there. it was now their property, how is that enforced?
The city could enforce it. That's written into the easement language. There's some pretty standard easement language that we have and King County and other jurisdictions have about these. I would say, like I said before, for larger projects like subdivisions, typically the city is going to want the critical area dedicated and not have it be in a separate easement because, well, partly for the reasons you just identified, is it's easier for the city to maintain and enforce those when they're city property. But for some other projects, it's not appropriate.
Okay. And it's not, yeah, we're not changing it across the board. We're just giving the alternate of allowing to put it into a native growth protection easement.
Correct.
An option. Okay. Any other questions? Nope. Okay.
Okay. Fences in front yards. This one is really related to preserving sight distance at intersections. And so the original proposal that the Planning Commission reviewed would have very heavily restricted fence height in all front yards, which is to say the area between the front of a house and the street, the sidewalk. After some further discussion, we really drilled down to, well, what's the purpose of this? And like I said, it's to maintain sight distance at intersections. And so the proposed amendment was rewritten to the form you see now, which would be to limit the fence height to 3 feet in front yards within 60 feet of an intersection. Currently, there is no limit. You can build a nice 6 foot tall fence without any permits at all on your property, which I hate picking on individual property owners, but you may all have noticed the fence that went up just down the road from City Hall 6 months ago, and that prompted the installation of an always stop at that intersection, King and River and is it Olmsted? I think it's Olmsted, because of sight distance issues. You can't see coming down King Street now to the side, and people who were stopped on River Street couldn't necessarily see traffic coming from the other direction. So having a lower fence height would help improve safety. And we tried to now craft the distance, the 60 feet distance, to really just focus solely on very close to intersections where it's a safety issue. And then outside of that, the existing fence height restrictions, which is to say there isn't really a fence height restriction, would continue.
So can you see at an intersection over 3 foot?
Yeah, I mean, 3 feet is 36 inches above the ground, and I won't say it's going to be universally helpful if you're driving a low hung sports car. You're not going to see over that, but if you're in a reasonably high off the ground vehicle, just a usual sedan, most people will be able to see over, at least see the top of a vehicle coming through that.
Councilmember Lassay?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, you started to mention front yards, and I don't think the title is fence height in front yards, but the amendments don't refer to yards. Because I think if you're only doing it in front yards, there are a few houses that have a side yard that is fronting intersecting streets. So I think if we need to address that a little bit deeper at council level, I think we should probably talk about it then. But maybe you can clarify, Jason, is it really related to just front yards? But because there's also some houses that have rear yards.
Yeah, and you're correct, but the let me find it. Sorry, I'm looking at my other computer, which is why you see me looking off to the side.
Yeah, I'm looking at your blue line markup.
Yeah.
That just refers to a section called fences, and I'm not sure if that fences is under a front yard or a side yard.
Yeah. So the technical reason we're using the term front yard is because in the code the term front yard is defined as meaning the yard bordering on a street, and in the case of a corner lot, maybe either frontage. So the way the city's code is written, we're specifically referring to any yard between the face of a building and the street. Recognizing that yes, there are side yards, there are rear yards, and yes, you have corner lots and everything, but
Okay, but you're confirming that the, what we would think of as a side yard is technically within the code considered a front yard affronting the street.
Yes.
But your ordinance doesn't list yards. List
Yeah.
zones.
And I'll say I opted not to use the term front yards in the code language because, call it my own, something of a personal attempt to make things more clear to lay people. That, you know, just as you identified, Councilmember Lissay, that it sounds like a term of art, but even though it is specifically defined, my feeling was writing it the way it's shown in the ordinance: fences located between buildings and public streets. It seemed like a better way to describe it so that anybody would understand it. But certainly if I'm absolutely open to just switching that to the term fences in front yards and relying on the definitions.
You're gonna get more pushback from me if you say front yards because
Fair enough.
Because zoning code does define front yard, side yard, rear yard, and you'll create some. So I don't have any problem with the way it's written in terms of fences located between buildings and public streets, and does not do the yard.
Okay.
But I'll defer to others too.
Councilmember Mayhew?
Yeah, so I'm just curious, do we grandfather existing fences that would not be in compliance?
Yes, we would.
And for an unlimited amount of time or for a limited amount of time?
The city's non-conforming use and structure code does not have a time limit. Certainly if it's completely destroyed by, say, a fire, that's a different situation, but as long as it's continually existing and maintained, it can continue indefinitely.
Okay, and then my other question was...
or Jim, I think the residential code does specify even, or so, like in certain policies like damage on a home for flooding, if more than 50% of the value, then it's considered, you know, there's a certain amount of damage that then triggers the grandfather's no longer applying.
Okay, but yeah, so what I'm hearing is it'll be grandfathered and the existing code deals with how grandfathering works and it would just follow that guidance that's already there, yeah?
Correct.
Okay, and then the question I have is why not just limit all fences to 3 feet? Why did you decide just within, I mean, I understood why 60 feet within an intersection was a particular problem. I understood that part, but I didn't understand if what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why didn't we think just do it uniformly?
That's certainly an option. Other cities do that where they do limit front yard specifically. So, you know, between a building and a street to whether it's 3 feet or 4 feet or 2.5 feet, that is an option. In this case, my approach was to, you know, the approach that we discussed with the Planning Commission was to try to make the minimal amendment needed to address the specific issue, which was a sight distance issue at intersections. But it's not to say that you couldn't do something a little different.
Okay, thanks.
And is this consistent with the Ridge ROA fence standards on the different heights? You put in 6 foot and 8 foot.
So the specific, what's at play there is that under the building code, any fence that's 6 feet or lower does not need a building permit. If they're taller than 6 feet, they do require a building permit. You have to engineer the foundations really. The 6 foot, 8 foot difference is pretty typical for commercial versus resident, or rather residential being 6 foot and commercial being 8 foot. Whether it conforms with the Ridge standards, I couldn't say.
But wouldn't our ordinance and zoning take precedence over what the Ridge standards are then, if we're putting in something different?
How this would interact with the Ridge standards, I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to actually look at the Ridge standards in whole to see what they do or don't say about fences, and then it becomes an interpretation issue of, you know, there is a provision in the mixed use final plan for both for both Ridge 1 and Ridge 2 that say in the absence of a ridge standard, the city's general zoning code applies, but then the question is it the current standard or is it the standard that existed in when the mixed use final plan was approved in, you know, whether it's 1995 or 2001, I believe, for SR2. So, like I said, that's the long way of saying that's an interpretation issue I haven't looked into. I can certainly do that, though.
Councilman Mayhew?
I was going to say that I'm not a lawyer, but generally, a citizen or a group of citizens that form themselves into an association cannot override a law. They can have additional requirements beyond the law. So they could set it lower than the law would allow, but they wouldn't be able to override the city law and say, we'll make it higher than the law, right?
What I'm stating is, if they said, oh, our fences are supposed to be 6.5 foot. Now the city comes in, because we're just choosing right now to say we'll allow 6-foot fences and 8-foot fences without clarifying what the ridge has approved, right? And so if we're just throwing in some numbers and haven't checked it, because they would be part of the zoning as well. And they're the majority of the land, the population, so we should look at that.
Yeah, I'll look into it to see what the ridge standards are presently.
Right.
Like I said, there is a building code requirement, though, that any fence over 6 feet in height requires a building permit. So that has typically worked as a soft cap on fence heights, just because going from 6 to 6.5 feet, for example, or 6 to 7 feet, adds in a building permit and engineering requirement that nobody really wants to get into for residential. For commercial, it's a different story, but that's why you see a lot of fence height restrictions at 6 feet,
Right.
because it's just in alignment with the building codes.
If you can just clarify.
Yeah.
It is, be great.
I think the mayor has his hand up.
Mayor Larson?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not 100% certain, but if memory serves over these years, I'm pretty sure that the ridge standards don't allow for any front yard fences at all. But that goes kind of to what I thought a great question that Councilor Mayhew was raising, and that's in any kind of codes like this, the question at hand is, well, what is the value that you're trying to wrestle with or deal with, it, whether it's a safety one or purely aesthetic one. And I thought his question about why just 60 feet within intersections, I suspect if you polled the vast majority of residents downtown, the vast majority would probably not like the idea of their neighbor building a big 6-foot fence on their front yard out toward the sidewalk or street. It would just aesthetically be very unpleasing. So I think it's a very, worthwhile thing to consider. Should it be community wide for things like that? And I thought it curious, Bob, Jim did kind of raise the question about whether the ROA has the authority to, I said I wasn't sure when he used the word higher, if he meant make a higher fence or a higher standard. But as far as I understand, they can enforce like a no fence standard on front yards.
Correct, but they couldn't mandate something that was otherwise in violation of city code.
Right, which in other words, they couldn't say 7-foot fences are okay, which would then be in violation of city code.
And typically when subdivisions are recorded, which is how the ridge was done, the CC&Rs are subject also to city approval before they're then recorded against the plat. In part for that review, so that we make sure that things are not inconsistent.
Yeah, in other words, no fence in a front yard doesn't violate any city standard, and so therefore the ROA making that a standard isn't in violation of any city laws.
Correct, but if they mandated, for example, 8-foot fences in front yards after this code provision, we would take issue with that.
So do you want to further study this one or pass it and then consider the heights and some of these other things back through Planning Commission? What do you want to do on the fence? Oh, Councilmember Mayhew?
Was there any input from the public sought by the Planning Commission, or is this just represent their views?
They did have a public hearing.
So no member of the public spoke to this issue. So what you're seeing is the outcome of the Planning Commission's discussion.
Did they discuss this particular issue of the 3 feet, and from my perspective in particular, whether or not to have that uniform or just within 60 feet of an intersection?
They actually are the ones who led to the within 60 feet of an intersection provision, because the original proposal back in February was to just limit it to 3 feet, period, in all front yards. And the commission was not comfortable with that. They thought it was, like I said, they thought it was not necessarily related to the original purpose, which was sight distance at intersections. And so they felt more comfortable with this wording than just a blanket 3 feet in front yards.
Well, Chair, my view is I'm not sure just the 3 of us should, you know, it seemed like this would be something the whole council should have input on, as opposed to just the 3 of us, whether to do, you know, so I'm sort of reluctant for us to try and change it, you know, without allowing the full council to see it.
Okay, well, we'll include it and we could bring it up as part of the discussion. But I'm wondering your slide that shows front yards. You don't include front yards in the ordinance. You include residential zones. And so what if it would change?
Yeah, I'd conform that. I think if you leave front yards in that, we'll spend 15 minutes chasing that rabbit when we don't need to.
I could spend 20 or 25 if you want.
Okay.
All right, I will retitle it before council.
Okay.
And
for my presentation, that is.
Right.
And I would also recommend on the first bullet point where it says limit height to 3 feet in front yards, I would match that to your language of fence, you know, between buildings and public streets, because that's what the language is actually referring to.
Right. Okay.
Okay, got it. Okay, moving on to the next one. Elevation of mechanical equipment in the floodplain. This would add a requirement that all mechanical equipment, this is water heaters, HVAC units, things of that nature, be elevated to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation for residential structures. The equivalent commercial requirement would be either elevate to or above the base flood elevation, or flood proof it if it's below the base flood elevation. This would give the city a few more points for the community rating system. I would note, as we continue moving toward getting a class 4 or higher rating, but the requirement would also mirror what we have today for the lowest finished floor of these structures. So the lowest finished floor of residential structures today need to be at least a foot above base flood elevation. So what you see for houses typically is you'll have a garage on the ground, and then the rest of the structure will be, you'll have to go up a few stairs to get to the right height. And usually we are seeing that people are elevating their mechanical equipment. They're putting it on a pedestal in the garage, for example, or they're putting it in the attic, or a closet or something. So I wouldn't necessarily say the immediate practical effect would be huge, but having the requirement is what gets us the CRS points, and it would certainly help with our with the community's flood resilience.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Oh, I see questions. Mayor Larson?
I just wanted to quick make the point that in experiencing some past flood events, this has been sort of a tough one to maneuver with. The questions come to us often, and well, hey, should we push this homeowner as they're restoring their home to put their mechanical equipment up high? And the problem and Jason, you can tell me, I think the advantage of having a stronger code requiring that is if a house has had a mechanical equipment damage and then they get FEMA reimbursement or insurance reimbursement, it's good to have this in the code because then the insurance would cover the cost of them perhaps relocating that equipment to a higher location like an attic or another location versus if it's not required, they would just say, well, just put it back like it is. And then that 5 years later, you get the same damage to the mechanical system or hot water tank because it's relocated to the same vulnerable location.
Right. Yeah, and you're correct, Mayor, that we have run into that issue in the past, and so this would aim to provide the requirement is you have to put your mechanical equipment up, so we're not fixing it again when the next flood comes, hopefully.
Good. Councilmember Lassay?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm trying to make sure I understand the way it's written in the non-residential construction section because it doesn't say, it just says elevated to or above the level of base flood elevation, gives you the three options. Is flood proofing, if you're at the level of base flood elevation, you would have to flood proof, but if you're one above, you wouldn't have to. It doesn't read, I'm not reading it very well, maybe.
Yeah, I'll admit the wording is a little awkward in the current code. What it means is that for commercial, your options are to either elevate to or above the base flood elevation, so right at the base flood elevation. There's no freeboard requirement for commercial. Or you can, if you want to place it below the base flood elevation, you have to flood proof, the structure and everything. Now, practically speaking, I'm not sure you could flood proof mechanical equipment below the base flood elevation. So this is effectively a requiring raising mechanical equipment for commercial buildings.
It is possible to do it. It's expensive, but it's possible to do it.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we're rewriting some of these, if it's now is the time to make it a little bit easier to follow, that folks would say. So you have to elevate it above to 1 foot above or flood proof it, as opposed to right now it's written as at elevated to or above the base, and then or you have to do 1 foot above and flood proof it. It just doesn't, it reads funny. I'm wondering if you could take a look at that. I don't want to, I can't sort it in my head, which means I wonder if it shouldn't at least get some, a second look at that, the end of part 1 and then sub bullet A seem to be at conflict.
Yeah. Well, I will say for a preview of coming attractions, we're actually going to be looking at some pretty substantial revisions to our flood code in the next couple of months because of FEMA has released some new maps, and they've also updated the federal requirements for flood regulations. And so that is actually coming up. We're starting that process with Planning Commission later tonight. So my thought was, because I hear you, the wording is awkward. My thought was to wrap that into the bigger flood hazard code rewrite that's going to be needed here very shortly. And in the interest of expedience on this, just adding the language as shown, even though it is awkward.
Yeah.
Anything else on elevation? Parking stall dimensions.
All right, parking stall dimensions. So you can see on the slide there what the current code requires for compact and standard stalls, and what the proposal is to essentially get us a little more differentiation between compact and standard. It would also provide for wheel stops, because right now the code doesn't say anything at all about wheel stops. And we've gotten this question for multiple development projects in the last year or so. Now, admittedly, the ridge is about to be, is approaching build out. It's not there yet. So the question probably won't come up in the immediate future, but it seemed like a good idea to first of all, add a little bit of a gap between compact and standard, because right now you can see the only difference is 6 inches in width and nothing in length. You can have a compact stall that is 7.5 feet wide and 18 feet long, and a standard stall that's 8 feet wide and 14.5 foot long. Which one is more compact? You tell me. We were aiming here to try to not make anything existing either non-conforming or too non-conforming. So you can see there's an intentional overlap for the most part with the existing stall dimensions. And then in the packet materials, this is on page 24 of the CDC packet, you'll actually see a table comparing Snoqualmie's current and proposed stall dimensions with a few other cities in the region. So they're pretty well in the ballpark there. Bellevue, for example, has a pretty crazy compact stall length of 13 feet 9 inches. Why, I don't know, but they do. The other impetus here is that, well, unfortunate, for better or for worse, the cars and trucks we're driving aren't getting any smaller in general.
Councilmember Lissay?
Yeah, I want to thank you for not listing Seattle standard, because it would take half the page to list the variations that they allow and the percentages. You guys are in my wheelhouse, so I have to make one comment. This change has essentially created a universal stall. As an architect and working for a developer, I could do a stall at 8 foot by 17 foot, and I comply with both compact and standard. So I think that's something to consider. That a lot of jurisdictions, I guess not a lot, some jurisdictions is the right phrase, have interjected in trying to create a universal standard stall size. Because if you're driving a vehicle and you're looking for a place to park, oftentimes you don't know whether a stall is compact or standard. You don't know what the different sizes are between Bellevue and Kirkland, or Issaquah and Bellevue, or North Bend and Snoqualmie. And you're just driving your car and looking for a place to park. And so a lot of places have gone to an 8 foot by 18 foot standard, or a 9 foot by 18 foot standard. I'm okay with the variations we have, but I think what you may find is creative architects will be drawing all of their parking stalls at 8 feet by 17 for standard, and compact at 7.5 by 15. That's just how we do it. We find the smallest required and we go with the smallest we have to. So I don't know if that's the right, I don't think that's going to be, my personal opinion is that's probably going to be difficult, because a accessible stall is required to be 8 by 19 now, I think it is. And our standard stalls will be, in most cases, will be smaller than that. It might create some conflicts. Anyway, I'm rambling on about stuff that I deal with on a daily basis. But the point is that I'm not sure comparing to other cities is the right way to go in this case. And I'm inclined to look at this one as being, I don't think we've hit the target yet.
You think these should be smaller, or I'm not?
I think they should be larger. I think well, let me say it differently. I think giving a range will result in architects drawing them at the smallest possible of the range.
Right.
So by default, your compact stalls will be 7.5 by 15. And your standard stalls will be 8 by 17. So I don't know whether it's necessary to do why you would do a range. Why would you give up the real estate if you don't have to?
Councilmember Mayhew, did you have?
Yeah, so I would just, for what it's worth, note that my vehicle is 18 feet long. I don't understand how this works. So the current code, the standard stall is 8 feet wide. I guess I presumed that was a minimum, but not a maximum, but maybe I'm wrong. And so then I was trying to understand the proposed standard stall. Is that saying the maximum it can be is 9 feet? I sort of don't understand what the range signifies. Is it a minimum and a maximum?
So the way the current code is written, the existing dimensions you see for width, the 7.5 for compact and the 8 for standard, are minimums, and there is no maximum. The length is those are the current minima and maxima for length. So you could build a 12-foot wide stall that's 14 and a half feet long, and that would technically be code compliant today.
So what's the advantage to the city or to our residents? What are we accomplishing by limiting the maximum width?
We're making an effort to efficiently use land is the argument, that you don't want there's an argument out there in city planning development circles that you want to, you need to provide parking, especially in a suburban area like this, but you don't necessarily want to take up any more valuable land with parking than you have to. And so one way to achieve that is by both limiting the number of stalls, but also limiting the size of the stalls. So that's the general argument. How much you want to buy into that is certainly, frankly, it's a question for the council to answer. Do you want to set a maximum on that or not? I will point out that there's an exception written into this that allows the director to grant exceptions for things like accessible spaces, RV truck trailer parking. So it's not, the intent here wouldn't end up being hard and fast. But yeah, I mean, if the council collectively decides, no, we want to allow these wider parking spots, that's okay.
Can I just ask, you mentioned earlier, so does our existing code limit the number, so there's a maximum number of parking spots you may have for every building, every lot in the city?
Correct. Most uses have a minimum and a maximum number of parking stalls. The single-family residential does not have a maximum. The minimum is 2, and then like I said, there's no maximum. And there's also a 30% limit on compact stalls. So up to 30% can be compact.
Got it. Thank you.
Mayor Larson? Can't hear you.
Thank you. I'm not pitching or suggesting you change your idea. I just like in these conversations to always start with the premise of what's the problem you're trying to solve, or what's the community value at work here. I think it does a lot to help inform the conversation. Because again, Councilman Osei made some great points about the minimization, but then it wasn't clear to me in terms of the community value our staff's trying to solve. Is that a bad thing? Sounds like what Jason said is no, we're trying to minimize impervious surface or minimize the use of land for parking. If safety was a factor, or ease, or we wanted to promote cars, whatever, that's critical to informing the code.
Councilman Osei?
Yeah, one last thing real quick. I won't dwell any longer on this. We'll talk about it at council. But thank you for putting on the wheel stops. That's a big issue. People don't recognize they don't have a wheel stop until they wish they had one, and they end up plowing into a wall or a shrub or into a ditch, all those sorts of things. So that is a big help. And I think the dimensional characteristic again falls in one of those sort of policy type of discussion. So let me bring something to the council when we do bring this up at the next meeting.
The great thing about wheel stops is the way they rip the bottom off the front of my car, where I used to have a nice little.
I'd rather taller car.
My car is perfectly sized. It's just high enough. As long as I keep it out of sport mode, I'm good.
Conversation at council, it sounds like. Okay, next one.
Okay, next one. Unclassified use permits, public hearings. So currently, this is what I would just term a minor technical adjustment. The unclassified use permit process, and this is a permit process designed to handle land uses that have high community impacts, or things where we just don't get them a lot. So good example is things like major utility siting requests, prisons, things like that, airports. Anyway, the way the code is currently written is it implies the city council could hold a second public hearing after the planning commission holds one. State law does not allow this and hasn't for quite some time. So this is just a minor change to say that the city council cannot hold another public hearing.
Councilmember Mayhew?
So just to make sure I understand this, a public hearing is a legal concept that has to do with what's in and out of the record, I believe. What I'm wondering is if the city council wanted to, so hypothetically, there's something goes in front of the planning commission, they hold the public hearing, the record's created, the item comes to city council. If the city council, would this preclude the city council from hearing citizen comments on the topic?
Yes, it would. This would, as a permit, this is a quasi-judicial process. And so the council could not take additional public comment because the record would be closed.
Got it. Thank you.
If I could just chime in real fast, this reflects existing state law, however. So that's the case anyway. What Jason's trying to do is get the code to line up with what state law already says. The council can hear argument from a party, but they can't have a new hearing and have a new open record hearing, take new evidence and expand the record.
Yeah, so that made sense to me. I understood that. I don't have any, I get that. I don't have any, it doesn't right now cause me any grief. I'll continue to think about it. But it just seems to me that logistically, we might have a little bit of a problem in a situation where, say, the planning commission has a hearing on a topic, but that topic has not yet come before the full council. We would need to preclude, then, if I'm understanding this correctly, we allow citizen comments during council meetings. We allow citizen comments for items not on the agenda. So if there was an intervening council meeting after a public hearing, but prior to this item being on the agenda for the full council, we would actually, if I'm understanding this correctly, need to preclude that as a topic as well. So it'd be items on the agenda or, items for which a public hearing's already been held. There would be a new limitation we would have to impose on public comment. Am I understanding?
Well, there's a bit of that exists already. If, for example, you have a council meeting and citizens stand up. Well, actually, we had this happen a while back, and citizens would come to a council meeting and try to talk about the Salish expansion when it was in between planning commission and the council, or when it hadn't even gone to planning commission yet. And we kind of had to say, wait, no, we're not taking comment on that. Now, those things they're not an appearance of fairness violation if they're set on the record and they're then made part of the record later. But what we're tiptoeing around here, or not tiptoeing, trying to align with, is the limitation of one open record hearing only. So that's, what the point you just made is getting to one of the finer points in kind of record cleanliness or hygiene, to use the council's favorite term. But we're really getting at the main, one open record hearing only, one closed record appeal hearing if there is one, and that's it, so that the parties aren't subjected to multiple sort of do-overs on the record.
Got it. Thank you.
I thought appurtenances was council's favorite word.
I'm just getting warmed up.
All right.
Okay.
Next one.
Right, then temporary pole banner signs. We would update the code to align our pole banner policy across all of our zoning districts. So it would say things like you can only attach pole banners to streetlight poles. You have to get a temporary sign permit or a special event permit. There's a time limitation of 21 days, and they have to be installed and maintained by city staff or the pole owner. For example, Puget Energy owns some of the streetlights. And the installation, maintenance, removal costs paid by the applicant.
That magic word that you just said, paid by applicant, if you look at the ordinance, it says paid for the applicant.
Uh-oh.
That would be changed.
I may have typoed that. Apologies if I did.
Yeah.
Let's see here. That's signs. Where's
left.
signs? No, it's in a different.
That's one of those major typos. It reminds me of that cartoon that says, "Let's eat."
Oh, yeah.
Or "Let's eat Bill." Commas matter.
Yeah.
You are correct. I will fix that.
Okay. Any comments regarding pole banners, temporary signs?
No, straightforward to me.
Okay, next one.
Then government signs. This would, as it says, clarify the conditions for city-owned and maintained signage. So it's more just a blanket. It says government signs are exempt from the processes and development regulations of the sign code, and they have to be erected and maintained subject to the rules and procedures established by, in this case, the community development director, and the city can remove all government signs at its sole discretion. So this is things like stop signs.
Would this be, I'll raise my hand first.
Councilmember Lissay?
I was going to hit raise my hand and raise my hand, but does this apply then to like directional signs, like street signs, like, Snoqualmie Parkway how we enlarge those, or does it apply to, basically, does it say that any sign that's provided by the government, meaning I assume any government entity, can be of any size and any shape and any style and any font and any color?
Dylan Gamble's here, and I'll let him respond to that.
So can you all hear me just fine?
Yep.
Okay. So the rules would still have to be followed for MUTCD standards, which are across the country to make consistent signage for driving conditions. So we have that on state highways as well as cities. That would still have to be followed, and those rules are pretty strict in terms of colors and the typeface that the font can be, things like that. This code is more applicable to a couple of these odd gray spaces in terms of city-owned signs, things like public notices on a sandwich board, or city-owned barriers on roads to signify street closures, things like that.
Okay, that helps, because that, and as long as we can bring up the MCTUD in council, that'll make Councilmember Sunwall very happy.
Okay.
One of the favorite acronyms.
That's right. Besides appurtenances.
Now, if we do it both in the same, those two words in the same meaning might cause a meltdown.
Any other comments regarding governmental signs? Oh, okay, next.
Okay. Anyway, I had the list here. The council wanted to identify items for further discussion, but we've done that as we've gone along. So then I'll just briefly show you the schedule here. We're CD committee tonight. We'll bring this to council next Tuesday for introduction, and then earliest action would be June 8th. Obviously that date could shift around a little depending on the council's ongoing discussion.
Okay. Does that sound fine to the council members?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Thumbs up.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on. AB 20060, SEPA appeals.
Okay. SEPA appeals. So, as you know, SEPA is the State Environmental Policy Act. Oh, excuse me, one second.
Need to close
Sorry,
this
my kids
equipment.
were running upstairs. I didn't want to have them screaming at you. So SEPA is an integral part of the development process, and as you know, there are various avenues permits can take to get approval. Some of them are what we would call administrative approvals, so that's done by a city staff member, usually the community development director. Others are approved by the planning commission or the hearing examiner, or in some cases the city council. SEPA currently is one of those, it is related to a lot of these permits, but not necessarily, it's not the same permit. It's in many respects a separate item. So right now, if somebody takes issue with the city's SEPA threshold determination, and that's a determination to say this proposed project will or won't have and the city attorney is going to correct me because I always get this wrong, significant adverse environmental impact, then their only option today is to sue the city. And when they sue the city, they need to also appeal the underlying permit, whether it's a preliminary plat or a clearing and grading permit, et cetera, et cetera. That's a pretty heavy lift. So what this amendment would do is it would add what we call administrative SEPA appeals. And this would be a way for a party to appeal it to the city's hearing examiner if they feel that the threshold determination was issued in error or needs to be corrected. So some highlights of what the proposed amendment would do, first it would provide for SEPA appeals to be heard by the hearing examiner. We'd also expand the description of the hearing examiner's duties and powers a little bit. And this language about the hearing examiner's duties and powers is largely borrowed, excuse me, from King County. So this isn't something that's being made up. King County has has their own in-house hearing examiner that does quite a bit of work. Clarify a few procedural requirements about things like standing and how the process works. We'd also set a $750 appeal fee for all hearing examiner appeals. The range of appeal fees in the region is between $250 to $750. I will say there's a policy decision for the council here on an appeal fee, because typically for development projects we do cost recovery. So the project applicant has a memorandum of understanding with the city that they will pay all of the city's costs, whether it's city staff time, city consultants to review it, things like that. Because an appeal wouldn't necessarily be the applicant's responsibility, unless the applicant's the one appealing it, is kind of the edge case there. It's difficult to expect them to pay for something they wouldn't necessarily have anticipated at the beginning. At the same time, we wouldn't necessarily want an appellant, somebody who's filing an appeal, to have to be responsible for all the hearing examiner costs. The hearing examiner is by contract, and the rate is approximately $250 an hour, which adds up really fast. The hearing examiner could spend 3 hours of time simply preparing for an appeal, to say nothing of actually sitting and hearing an appeal and then writing a decision. So the appeal fee is really intended to help us avoid frivolous appeals and provide for a minimal amount of cost recovery for the city. But where that balance lies is, like I said, that's a policy decision for the council to say, we want a higher fee, we want a lower fee, because you get to balance the public interest in being able to appeal things with the city's expenses in such an appeal. Finally, I'll highlight a major point here, and this gets back to when we were talking about the one public hearing issue for unclassified use permits. If a SEPA appeal is filed, that SEPA appeal would be heard by the hearing examiner, and this is pretty important, that you would want a trained professional hearing a SEPA appeal, because these are technical, these are very technical proceedings. In cases where we have permits where the public hearing would normally be done by the planning commission, that hearing would then be done by the hearing examiner instead. Important point, this applies to 3 types of permits. It applies to planned unit developments, it applies to mixed use final plans, and it applies to planned commercial industrial plans. Are the 3 affected. The council still retains the decision on these, but the hearing would not be done by the commission, the planning commission. It would be done by the hearing examiner. So that's an important point to remember here. But this all stems back to, as the city attorney noted, the state law requirement of only one open record hearing and one closed record appeal hearing. In this case, this would be an open record hearing. So there's no real way to have a separate SEPA appeal hearing and a planning commission project permit hearing. And I think the city attorney probably has some more to add, so I'll let him jump in here whenever he's ready, if he wants to.
Excuse me.
He's preparing.
The one, in addition to the one open record hearing limitation that we talked about a moment ago, the requirements in the regulation for SEPA administrative appeals specifically state that the appeal hearing, I mean, it flows out of this one open record hearing requirement, but the SEPA administrative appeal regulation specifically says that the SEPA appeal hearing must be consolidated with and heard by the same body or decision maker that is hearing the project permit. And so that's the need for, and for this, what would be a process change if there is an appeal for consolidating it in front of the hearing examiner. So it's not just the open record hearing, one open record hearing requirement. It's the specific requirement in SEPA that says, and if you have a SEPA appeal, that it must be consolidated with and heard by the same decision maker that's going to make the project permit decision.
Aren't those supposed to be combined?
Yes.
So combined to go to be actually to the hearing examiner.
Correct.
Yeah.
And right. That's stealing Jason's thunder here a little bit, but you'll see his comparison to other jurisdictions, but the vast majority of jurisdictions in the Seattle area provide for a hearing examiner to hear SEPA appeals, and then of course to make those same project permit recommendations or decisions depending on what they might be. And as Jason said here, this wouldn't take the council out of the loop. It's just that the recommendation, you would get findings and conclusions and a recommendation from the hearing examiner instead of from the planning commission. And they would be combined findings, conclusions on both the SEPA appeal issue and the underlying PCI plan, and then the EIS would come to you along with that decision.
Okay. It looks like Councilmember Mayhew has flown from Hawaii to the Alps, perhaps? I'm not sure. You have your hand up, Councilmember?
Yes, you got to keep up. Things are moving fast around here, baby. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on this point. Oops, I'm trying to use the exact term you used, Mr. Sturbank. The project permit process is a quasi-judicial process. Is that correct?
Correct, it is.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Are there comments or questions regarding this?
I would add, as the city attorney mentioned, there is a list. It's on page 30 of the committee's packet that highlights what other cities in the region do. The list of cities with an administrative appeal, SEPA appeal to the hearing examiner, is larger than the list of those without, for what that's worth.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, and then the other thing that's in the memo that I didn't mention verbally here is that it talks about, and we talked about this with the plat procedures amendment last year, is providing for a local appeal. Right now, as I mentioned, there's no local SEPA appeal. There's no way to appeal a threshold determination without going to court. This would add a way to do that without having to go to court and make it at least a little bit more accessible than having to deal with the court's procedures and costs. So.
Councilmember Mayhew, hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I found Mr. Rogers' explanation around the fee and the considerations extremely helpful and thorough. It absolutely helped me understand the policy decision, the basis, sort of the range of possible and why this was being recommended. I thought it was extremely helpful, and I would just encourage present that in the same way to the council. I found it just fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, or on the staff report, it's under analysis, there's an X, under recommendation, there's an X, under budget, there's an X. So can we actually expand on each one of those?
You'll see under background, it says see PDF attachment. And so if you scroll to the next page, it's there. The reason we did that is because that table with the various cities didn't format at all in the agenda builder. We can take a stab at reconsolidating it all back in the agenda builder, but the formatting will get lost.
I would put some information in those, and still you could reference the PDF, I would think.
Okay.
Any other comments regarding?
Mhm.
We only have 12 minutes left, and the next item was downtown historic relook. I think we'll need to move this. I received Councilmember Lestay's input, and I've done my input. Councilmember Mayhew, you get a chance to review it within the next community development meeting.
Too late. It's already in your inbox.
Ah,
He sent it, well, you sent it 2 minutes after the meeting started, I think.
And so
But importantly, before Councilmember
Before.
Ross asked me for
oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, we will kind of look at, maybe each of us kind of look at the comments and come with some, be ready to talk about it. Let's figure out how we want to discuss it at the next meeting. And so we can put that on the agenda for the next meeting.
Yeah, I'd recommend that we try to tackle this via email before the next meeting. So when we do get together, because we will, at that time, I believe we will have some non-utility CIP stuff to talk about or other budget issue stuff to talk about. So let's go through what I think Jim did a good job of in the 1 minute I had to look at it of compiling each of our comments on each item, and let's maybe see if we can come to a virtual direction before we engage the planning commission.
it seemed to me that we were fairly close on most items, and a little bit of working like you're suggesting, Councilmember Ross. I think we'll get honed down to a bunch of things we're fairly close on, and a few things that are worth discussing.
Okay, sounds good. Any other comments before we adjourn?
Madam Chair, just a clarification, are both the code change ordinances moving forward to full council then?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Right. Let's adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll share.
Here? No. You missed the comments from the public.
No. Stop recording.